No,
Greetings, Chris Anderson. Greetings.
Yes.
What country are you in? What continent are you in? Where are you? Close your eyes quick and tell me.
Well, I am back in Britain, as you can tell from the heavy Norwegian fishing sweater that I'm wearing, and that was a little bit of adjustment.
It's not the colonial, not the tropical weather that you were.
No, I've packed away my pith helmet for the year. The sun is oddly shining, so that's good, but it is cold. It is cold.
It was 30 degrees in Cleveland yesterday. I was there for Bernie Bluestein's funeral, Ghost Army veteran. It's supposed to be 78 degrees in Chicago today. Really? I honestly don't know what to wear. Whatever I wear, I'm stripping it off or throwing something else on.
Yeah, just careful with that visual, Rick.
Ooh, woo, woo. Okay, welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, the salacious version. Yes. Thank you to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for their assistance in bringing you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. We have an encore episode today, Chris, which is we're recording it here on the Thursday before, and we'll be talking about Hitler's rise to power. So that's
a cheerful topic.
It is a fascinating story that we did. About 9 months ago with Timothy Ryback, and so that's
a very good book. Very good.
Really good book. A great interview with him. Whether you're watching live, watching on replay, listening in your car to the HHH. Oh, do it.
Podcast.
Yeah, podcast.
Podcast.
Welcome. And Chris, we should say thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. Oh, if I can find the right page here, I'll put up our Patreon Top Shelf patrons.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Really appreciate it. Absolutely. And you can become a patron at patreon.com/historyhappyhour. It's really easy to spell.
Yeah. Hey, did I tell you about our amazing viewers? And I don't know if this person I'm going to tell you about in Guam that I met in Guam is a Patreon supporter because he wasn't there for very long. Did I tell you this story?
I don't think so. Go ahead.
All right. So the two groups for the Pacific tour were there in the lobby waiting for a bus to somewhere. And somebody I didn't know came up to me and said, "Do you have your bookshelves yet?" And I looked, and he said, "I watched the show." And then he went away, and I was like, Who was that masked man? I didn't even have time to say no.
Did you ever find out who he was?
No.
Was he in your group?
No, he was in the other group. And we're
it's just like a random. I'm in Guam. I run into somebody who watches History Happy Hour.
Both groups were getting ready to go to the final dinner. So what they do is they bus everybody out there, and then you have your final dinner, and that's it. So I didn't see him at the final dinner, so I was like, "Who is this person?" And now my lack of bookcases is known all over the world.
So person who ran into Chris Anderson in Guam. Yeah, identify yourself.
Would you please let us know?
Send us an email. Come on the chat. Do something so that we know who you are. We like to. We have the monitoring system
in person
for keeping track of all of our viewers. So how long are you back home for? When do you depart again?
Well, I'm back in the United Kingdom until the 18th, and then I start my SOE tour. So
fantastic!
I'll be in the United Kingdom, but I will be on tour.
I'm gonna bet that you'll visit Baker Street on that tour.
Several stops on Baker Street.
Yes,
like a whole morning on Baker Street.
Most excellent. Excellent. Are you gonna visit the Sig Sally?
Time permitting.
It's not really an SOE thing, but it is.
It's right down the street from the Dutch section of SOE. So that's where the England spiel happens. So that's like a big to do.
So cool.
Yeah. So we might pass by Sig Sally.
So I'm sure it's going to be a great trip. Okay, so we're 4 minutes and 15 seconds into the show. People are saying, "Where's the interview?" So I mean, they're probably dropping like flies. So give me a cue and let's get started.
Oh, nice ring tonight. Very
good,
well
good. The bar is open, and today we're going to travel back in time to the 6 critical months before Adolf Hitler became chancellor of Germany, but when the Nazi leader teetered between triumph and ruin. And our guest tonight, or this afternoon in the U.S., we're all in Europe. Our guest tonight is Timothy Ryback, author of Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power. And Timothy is a real Hitler scholar. He's written on history and politics for more than 3 decades. He's the author of Hitler's Private Library, which Chris can give you a shout out for, and The Last Survivor. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, Atlantic, elsewhere. He is co-founder and director of the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation in The Hague, and he joins us from southern France, where the Wi-Fi is just awesome. Timothy Ryback, welcome to History Happy Hour.
The weather is better than it is in Berlin. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rick. Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Timothy, did you bring a cocktail tonight, or did you get overwhelmed with too many other things?
In the south of France, it's not a cocktail, it's called rosé. And when it's really hot, you can put ice cubes in it too. But
terrific. Well,
do they kick you out of France if you put ice cubes in your rosé?
No, it's actually almost de rigueur here in the south. When it gets hot. It's a part of the summer plunk.
I've got an Affligan, although most of it seems to be gone. And Chris, are you armed and ready?
The thing I love about live audiences, I have a gin and tonic because the gin fairies just float down and it appears.
Yeah, no one's coming to bring me gin and tonic. So Timothy, we've just come through celebrating the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. Lots of books have come out about the battles, about the atomic bomb. You're dealing with a much earlier time period, 1932 and 1933, the last 6 months before Hitler became chancellor. What made you decide that this was the right time to do that book?
Well, I guess living in the world we're living in and watching some of the political developments here in Europe, watching a lot of the dynamics in the United States and other parts of the world, I just began to hear a lot of resonances with what was going on, in particular in the late Weimar period. We can go into details on that, but I just thought it was worthwhile revisiting this, and where a lot of the attention goes is on Hitler's seizure of power. He becomes chancellor on January 30th, 1933, and very quickly establishes the dictatorship, what we come to know as the Third Reich, and everything that follows from that. But I think there's less attention paid to the lead up to that and what actually happened to the Weimar democracy, or constitutional republic, that in a matter of 6 months began to totter, crumble, and then collapse. So I decided to take a sort of a look at that. What I decided to do, think that was possibly different from previous histories. As you mentioned, I've been writing about this for a long time, but I decided to forget everything that I know. And I only looked at primary sources, first of all, but also basically followed the daily press without knowing what was going to happen the next day. Because I think what happens with historians, and as part of the profession, is to tell us how we got from where we were to where we are. And what that requires is sort of this filtering process. You need to take the things that make sense for the final outcome. It also requires a filtering out of a lot of the white noise that was there at the time. And so, as I say, I just sort of tossed myself into the moment, which was basically July 1932, and began sort of walking through those last 6 months, literally on a day-by-day basis, sometimes on an hour-by-hour basis, watching how things were unfolding.
So, Timothy, well, you have a quote right at the beginning of the book from Dorothy Thompson, And she says, when I walked into Adolf Hitler's room, I was convinced that I was meeting the future dictator of Germany. In something like 50 seconds, I was quite sure that I was not. It took just about that time to measure the startling insignificance of this man who had just set the world agog. And she's not the only person that's making this observation. So, what are these observers getting wrong about Hitler?
I don't think they got anything wrong. I think she called it for what it was. And, Dorothy Thompson was literally one of the top leading journalists of the era, one of the most insightful individuals. And she sat down with him basically a year before he became chancellor. And she looked at this guy and she said, wow, what's going on? Hitler, part of his success was being underestimated. But I think the person who said it best in explaining Hitler is Ian Kershaw, who, wrote this, immense, magnificent 2-volume history, biography of Hitler. And at the end of it, in going through all of this, he says, actually, he remains one of the most unknowable, unfathomable figures of the 20th century, major historical figures. And what he ultimately attributes it to, and this guy, after writing 1,600 pages, is that this guy had the luck of the devil. And I think when you look at the number of points at which Hitler could have failed, should have failed, it's really rather astonishing. And so, I think, let's say, Dorothy Thompson slightly overstates it when she talks about the immense insignificance of this man. But I do think he was somebody who kind of stumbled and bumbled his way into power, knowing exactly what he was doing, having some of the things fall in place just right for him at the right time. And as I said, that in writing this book, in researching it, you keep saying to yourself, how did he make it through this one? How did he make it through this one? And again and again and again. And even 6 months, a week before he becomes chancellor, one of the leading left-wing newspapers publishes a cartoon called The New Hamlet, the Neue Hamlet, and it's a picture. Oh, there it is. Yeah, there you go. This is a week before Hitler's chancellor. It's called The New Hamlet. It shows Hitler standing in the graveyard of his political movement, and you see the broken swastika crosses, and basically he was written off at the time. You see the ascending, hammer and sickle in the sky overhead. But the point was, this is a week before Hitler's chancellor, and in the course of, literally the last weekend in January, things turn around and Hitler finds himself in that position. Now, once he's there, he says this as he's standing on the balcony, with the famous torchlight parade, not far from where, Chris, not far from where you are right now. Right. But as he's standing there on the balcony, he said, basically no one's going to get me out of here except over my dead body. I'm not going anywhere. And he spent the next 53 days securing that power to make sure it happened. But the potential for him to fail in the lead up to that is really quite astonishing.
And indeed, they had to drag his cold dead body out of there. So, can you set the scene for what the situation is when your book starts 6 months before Hitler is chancellor? I think a lot of people might not have a strong sense of, kind of what's going on. And maybe you can introduce a few of the people maybe Hindenburg, Schleicher, Papen, Strasser, who are going to play a role in the next 6 months?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think the moment, and it has to do with electoral politics. Before the crash of 1929, the National Socialists, the Nazis, had 12 seats in the Reichstag. They were a marginal party in a 600-seat legislative body. So they were completely insignificant. Come the crash of 1929, it devastates the German economy, unemployment soars, and suddenly in one of the national elections, this was September of 1930, they go from 12 seats to over 100 seats, so almost 10 times the number. And suddenly, they're a major player on the scene. They're the second most powerful political force in the country. Come the next election, they double that number again, and now this brings us to July of 1932. And this is where my book begins. But, the Nazis score 37% of the electorate. They're suddenly the single largest political force in the country. And keep in mind, we're talking about a parliamentary system. Germany has north of 30 political parties. I mean, there are 5 major parties, but commanding 37% of the electorate makes you a major force on the political scene. Hitler, with his 37%, goes in to see Hindenburg, who is president at the time. This is, Paul von Hindenburg, a great war hero from the Great War, comes out of retirement. This is Hindenburg at the radio announcing that he was running for the presidency for a second term. Hindenburg had, at this point, he's 84 years old. What you need to keep in mind, put him in context, Hindenburg retired from the military. He was a military guy. He retired in 1914. A war breaks out. He comes out of retirement to serve his country. Ends up becoming the great Hindenburg, wins the Battle of Tannenberg, and wins the great victories of the war, and sees the country through it to 1918. Germany is defeated. Hindenburg goes into retirement, and as everyone does once they reach retirement, he writes his memoirs, and he's a monarchist at heart. Regrets the fall of the Kaiser, but basically makes peace with it and sets out write his memoirs. A crisis comes in 1925, and they need a president for the country. And they say, could you please, he's convinced to run because he's the one national figure who can really unify the nation. So he runs for president, he wins. It's a 7-year term. Okay, which now these, so he serves his 7-year term. He's not necessarily committed to the democratic process and structure, but he is a military man. He's a Prussian. He has sworn an oath to the Constitution. And so, as someone said, Hindenburg followed the Constitution the way a field officer follows instructions in a military manual. So he did what he was told to do. He kept basically the ship of state afloat and on track through some very turbulent times, with the intention of retiring in the spring of 1932 at the end of his 7-year term. Adolf Hitler decides to enter the presidential election at that time, and Hindenburg is forced to run again just to keep Hitler out of the presidency. The guy's 84 years old, another 7 years, elected to another 7-year term, which is essentially for him a death sentence in office. He knows he will die. This is a guy who tried to retire back in 1914. So he's not enamored of Hitler because Hitler has forced this on him. But so, Hindenburg beats Hitler in the election by 6 million votes. Hitler then turns around. His party does well in the July elections, and he walks into Hindenburg's office and he says, now I'm head of the largest party. I want to be, I need to be appointed chancellor and form a government. And Hindenburg at that point tells him to his face, I don't like your divisiveness. I don't like the hatred. I don't like the anti-Semitism. I would never appoint you chancellor for the sake of God, my conscience, and the country. So Hindenburg basically boots Hitler out. Hitler then, with his 37%, moves into obstructionist political mode. And he knows with that he can paralyze the legislative process. And listen to Hitler's calculation here. Hitler said that 37%, Hitler understands democracy as well as anyone. And Hitler says 37% is 75% of 51%, meaning a simple majority. So if I control a simple majority by this relative majority, I control the country. And he actually sets about doing this. He brings down one government. He basically paralyzes the legislature, so they're forced to dissolve. They're forced to call new elections. He brings down a chancellor. They bring in another chancellor through various reasons. That other chancellor, and this is Kurt von Schleicher, is then brought. Well, first of all, there was Papen, who comes down. That's Franz von Papen, who was the one who was basically the sort of the puppet master behind the scenes. He was a very manipulative person, but some people claim not very bright. They used to say that his head was used for carrying a top hat rather than brains. And I think my favorite, since you're historians, my favorite anecdote on von Papen is that during World War I, he was actually serving in Washington, D.C., and he was running the German espionage network. He was writing checks to his spies, but ended up leaving the checkbook with the stubs with everyone's name on it there. So basically handed to the Americans, the entire German espionage network in the country. Anyway, he comes back and, he's an aristocrat. He moves around in these elite circles and is kind of a political player, but is not necessarily seen as the brightest light in the room. The other person that we need to talk about is Kurt von Schleicher, who was the one, the famous Clausewitz that war is politics by other means. With Schleicher, it was war, politics is war by other means. And he was much more of a political strategist than he was a military strategist. He wore a uniform, but he actually was the key political player in Berlin at the time. The New York Times bureau chief there said that anything that happens in German politics, which is incomprehensible, can be traced back to Kurt von Schleicher. And Schleicher had the confidence of Hindenburg. So basically, he was the Hindenburg whisperer, and was moving politics in certain directions. There was a tension between both Papen and Schleicher on this. Schleicher toppled Papen. Schleicher then became chancellor. Papen then turned around and toppled Schleicher. And this was in January of 1933. Hindenburg was left without a chancellor, and the only person to sort of fit the bill at that time was Adolf Hitler. So despite that vow in August that, I would never appoint you chancellor, 6 months later, Hitler's in that place. Now, when Papen did propose Hitler as chancellor, Hindenburg said he would agree to do it on one condition, which is that I'm never left alone in a room with that man. He referred to Hitler as the Bohemian corporal. Actually, another incident from going back to August, when Hindenburg publicly said he would never appoint Hitler chancellor. In private, he said, if I were to appoint him to anything, it would be as postmaster general, so he can lick me from behind on my stamps. So this was a man who was not inclined to Hitler, but through circumstances ended up being forced to appoint him.
So Timothy, one of the things, though, that it really struck me in reading the book, there are names that frequently pop up in more general histories of the war, but what I realize is we don't really know much about them. So maybe you could touch on some of the other kind of leading lights in this right-wing world that Hitler's working in, and I'm thinking of the Strasser brothers. Is it Hugelberg?
Hugenberg.
Sorry. But some of these other people that are players, and in reading your book, I mean, it seems like Strasser is really the guy that should have been the up-and-coming wonder. So maybe, these people are and why they fell away.
Okay, well, let's start with Gregor Strasser, who, the Nazi movement, the party was called the National Socialist Workers Movement. Hitler was the nationalist, Strasser was the socialist. The two of them were like yin and yang for the movement. It was Strasser. Hitler was, the sort of the beer hall brawler. He was the rabble rouser. Strasser was the real political guy, and he knew how to structure the party. It was a fairly disorganized organization. Well, Strasser ended up reorganizing the party to align the party chapters with the voting districts in Germany. And it helped facilitate this huge rise in voters for National Socialists. Equally important with Strasser, Hitler was sort of this hot-headed personality. Now, Chris, you're up in Berlin, which is part of Prussia. Germany is a large, complicated country, but you actually have two major geographic entities there. One is the Prussia that we know. The other is Bavaria, the second largest of the states. There's a different culture, a different orientation, and Hitler was very much a part of the Munich scene. He was this hot-headed political rabble-rouser. Well, in sort of the Prussian North, that didn't go over well. They didn't understand it. And Strasser appealed to the North German sentiments much better. And so the two of them basically divided up the country. Hitler did the South, Strasser, with his brother Otto, did the North. There ultimately became a conflict, and once again, we're going back to the autumn of 1933. 32. This is when Hitler has been thrown out of Hindenburg's office. The party actually is thrown into crisis. Through a series of elections, the party is almost bankrupt. In a November election, they actually begin losing votes. And Strasser turns around and says, in order to save the party, we need to enter into a coalition government with other conservative parties. Hitler wanted nothing to do with it. He wanted to be dictator on day one. It was all or nothing with Hitler. And the two of them had a falling out over this. Hitler ultimately prevailed and forced Strasser out of his positions and sidelined him. And ultimately, during the Night of the Long Knives, had Strasser executed, murdered. So Strasser, and then essentially was erased from the party history, but also historians tend to underestimate the role that Strasser played. And so he does seem to be a marginal figure until you're in the middle of it. Oswald Spengler knew both men, and it was Spengler who said of the two of them, Strasser by far the superior person intellectually and even politically.
I want to remind everybody that we are chatting here today with Timothy Ryback, who is the author of Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power. We've seen a number of comments in the comment stream. There are audio issues and video issues, and there are. But Timothy, I can hear you. I've gotten 92% or 96% of what you're saying, so I think we're good. And everybody else, I think the content's really interesting. I hope you can hang in there. So there's a lot of questions I could ask, but here's the $64,000 question for me. Everybody in Germany, I think, after reading your book, I would say everybody in Germany knows or should know that the first thing Hitler wants to do when he becomes Reich Chancellor is to become a dictator. He wants to do away with democracy and start a dictatorship. And yet, at different times, all of the leaders, Hindenburg, Schleicher, Papen, Hugenberg, who we haven't talked too much about, who's a fellow conservative leader, not to mention business leaders and bankers, they all seem to feel that, well, okay, Hitler wants to get into power, he wants to do this, but we'll be able to control him. We'll control him. So how do they get this so wrong? How is it that it turns out that he's not controllable at all, that he's in fact the one calling the tune?
Hitler he set out to destroy democracy through democratic processes, and he succeeded in it. I think if he's underestimated in anything, it's understanding the vulnerabilities of democratic systems, of the parliamentary processes, the legislative processes. And what you mentioned a number of groups there. Keep in mind, when Hitler became chancellor, he only had, at that point, as I mentioned, the party was in decline. He only had 33% of the Germans behind him. So 2/3 of the country were against Hitler. You mentioned, everybody on the left, the social democrats, the communists, the centrists were against him. The industrialists were against him. What Hitler was able to do was, and they disliked 80% of, everyone disliked 80% of what Hitler represented, but it was for everyone, it was a different 80%. And what Hitler did was to take those pieces that he could be attractive to individual groups, and he went after them, and he made disingenuous promises, sometimes outright lies, but usually these vague assumptions about things that would bring people on board. For the Christian centrists, he offered to say, we will be a Christian nation. I will make approaches to the Vatican to normalize relations. With business, he was offering them various concessions, most importantly, moving the country to a war economy, allowing the country to rebuild its military, which helped with employment, which helped with profits, which helped bring people on board. So with everyone, he was offering a little piece of something. To my mind, what's most interesting in these equations, when you're looking at Hitler in the last 6 months in his rise to power, and once he's in there, is the absence of anti-Semitism. When you look at Hitler's speeches, and when we look back, it is the end point of this entire history is the Holocaust. It's Auschwitz, it's Treblinka, it's Bergen-Belsen. But when you're in that moment, and believe me, I've read way too many Hitler speeches from the fall of 1932, there's rarely a mention of the the final solution, anything related to Jewish conspiracies. It's the economy, stupid. It's about inflation. It's about unemployment. It's about the threat of communism. And even in these meetings that he has, you see in the first weeks and months, the first weeks of his chancellorship, it's all about issues related to the economy, about bringing law and order back to the public spaces, about introducing draconian tariffs, about abrogating treaties that he felt Germany was unfairly committed to or forced to commit itself to. But very little talk about anti-Semitism. It was there, and it emerged, but he waited, and this is where he did know how to play things, which pieces to push, which issues to advance. And the other thing I'd mention there, when you say, okay, everyone felt that and which is true, the opinion was Hitler could be kept in check. Hitler was chancellor. Hermann Göring was a minister without portfolio in his cabinet, and a man named Frick was the minister of the interior. But Hindenburg, when he appointed Hitler chancellor, did not let him have the economy, he did not let him have foreign relations, and he did not let him have the military. That was bone bound. So they kept what they felt were the most important and critical pieces out of Hitler's hands. And some of these people, like Hugenberg, who had the economy, was an outright enemy of Hitler's. So the feeling was, look, we've given him a minister without portfolio and a minister of the interior. You can't do too much damage. Well, Hitler worked with what he had, and he was able to target those areas in the country and begin disassembling the democracy through that means.
So, given what you said earlier about the number of parties in Germany at the time, I think you said 30. I could be wrong, but a lot. And given what we all know about how it turns out, it's hard to kind of separate yourself from that. But you describe a world in which Hitler is not the most important player for a lot of this, and there are other players, there are other parties, there are other situations. And one thing I was really curious about is how much is the rest of the world, and specifically America, aware of him and his movement, and do they even care? Is this something that because of what happens, we so focus on him? If I was an American in Boston in 1931, 32, would I be aware of the Nazis? Would it even be on my horizon? Would I be saying, who is this guy? Should I be worried?
course, the French internet was interfering. This is a Franco-German connection. Could you? I think you were asking about American perceptions.
That was the short version of my answer. My question was, what are Americans thinking about this? Do they even know about it? Is it on their radar?
Oh, absolutely. The New York Times is doing so they're following all of Hitler's major speeches, all of this that's going on. But my favorite New York Times headline, in fact, is when Hitler is appointed chancellor, the big bold-faced headline says, Hitler gives up demand to be dictator. It was, and this is January 31st, 1933, and this is New York Times reporting, which tells you where perceptions were at the time. And because Hitler, until that point, as I said, this was the conflict we had with Strasser said, we need to enter into a coalition government in order to save our movement and to get a foothold in power. Hitler was an all or nothing guy. But then suddenly, when the party is really in crisis and the opportunity is there, he then suddenly, this is in literally the last weekend in January, he decides to step up to the plate and enter into a coalition government. Papen, in fact, had gone to him and said, look, I'm going to be chancellor, you'll be my vice chancellor. And Hitler said, I'll have none of that. So Papen did become vice chancellor, Hitler became chancellor. But the idea was that, as we mentioned, they could keep him under control and boxed in. Papen famously said, in 2 months' time, we'll have him in a corner so tight that he'll squeak. So, the sense was they were able to, this guy was boxed in and he was under control. This is where Hitler was underestimated in his ability to erode and undermine the system very effectively. And we also cannot forget about the Reichstag fire, right? Once again, Chris, that's right around the corner from you in Berlin.
I just, reading your book, I felt like the lesson here is that Hitler shows us the power of being a bully, right? He's just never going to back down. He's never going to compromise. And it made me wonder, and I wonder what you think about this, is this story an indictment of democracy? I mean, is democracy unable to handle people who will use it so callously?
Rick, that's it's a really good question. There were flaws. There were flaws in the Weimar Constitution. There's a famous saying that the Weimar Republic died twice. It was murdered and it committed suicide. Hitler was not the only person with dictatorial aspirations. He was, without question, the most effective public speaker, orator. He was the most effective strategist in terms of moving forward, in terms of getting the right people with him. But this is going back to the Kershaw thesis. He also had the luck of the devil. And as you mentioned, and what's amazing with Hitler is the hard line, and this is where, quote unquote, give him credit, when Hitler was faced with crises, and you may have said, look, I'll throw in the towel, or okay, let's compromise here. Hitler refused to compromise. He took this hard line. I'd mentioned the National Socialists peaked in the July 32 election with 37%. When there was a second election in November of 32, they lost 2 million votes and were down to 33% and started hemorrhaging both votes and membership. The party started, this is when the crisis came with Strasse. The party was in a real crisis. It was bankrupt politically, financially, and even economically. And Hitler's response to this crisis was, well, the people that we're left with are the ones that we know will be loyal to us. And he didn't try to compromise. And this is where he had the falling out with Strasse. The chips fell his way come January, and that's when he found himself in power. But frankly, had things gone on another 6 months, there never would have been Hitler chancellorship. And the party itself was in such crisis that it would not have, it really had reached its high water mark at that point. Because keep in mind, some of the other factors were the German economy was beginning to stabilize. Unemployment had leveled off and started dipping down. The Germans had renegotiated the reparation payments. They were looking for parity in their arms negotiations, in sort of these arms negotiations in Geneva. So a lot of Hitler's talking points were actually falling away, as was some of the support from the party. So he lucked out in this moment in January of 33. Had this happened 6 months later, the country would have been in a very different place. And I think 20th century history would have been very different as a result.
So, okay, another question I had, of course, there's always, I'm here in Berlin, and I've been with a group of great people now for almost 2 weeks, and we're talking about the rise of the Nazis. We've been to Poland. We've seen all of this horrific stuff, and there's always the question of, how much support does he actually have, versus he was kind of forced upon the people, or he was kind of thrust into power, and that's too big a question for the time we have left. But one thing I am curious about, kind of specific to your book, from the time he's appointed chancellor to prior to the Reichstag fire and the Enabling Act, what is the reaction of the German people? Are there people saying, "Oh my God, what have we just done"? Are they excited about this? Do they have any reaction at all? I mean, where are the German people when they get the news that Hitler's the new chancellor?
Hitler was appointed chancellor on Monday, January 30th, 1933, 11:30 in the morning. We know there was that torchlight parade that evening when 20,000 stormtroopers marched through the Brandenburg Gate down Unter den Linden and then past the Chancellery where Hitler stood there. 20,000 people. On Sunday afternoon, the day before, when there were rumors that Hitler might be appointed chancellor, 100,000 Berliners assembled in protest to the Hitler government. And keep in mind, we're coming out of these elections. So basically, Hitler had 33% of the people we know voted for him. The vast majority of Germans did, 2/3 of the country had not voted for his party. And there was dismay and despair. When you read the press at the time, how is this even possible that this man has been appointed chancellor? Through a process of intimidation, through a process of give me time, Hitler was asking, he said, his phrase was repeatedly, look what 14 years of democracy have ruined this country. Give me 4 years to rebuild this, this destroyed economy, this destroyed society. In the course of that, and I think this is through certain public incentives that came along, through very effective propaganda and also through a very systematic form of intimidation at every level of society. He was able to gradually get, I would say, in fairness, the majority of the Germans on board with him.
We're coming near the end, and there's a question that I really wanted to ask you about because it relates to something we were talking about Friday. So it's not directly about your book, but I think it's an interesting area. A lot of this story unfolds in the Obersalzberg area, where people are coming to Hitler's home. He's meeting with Goebbels and others there in the front room. I'm going to be there a week from today, actually. And you spent, 15 years in the Obersalzberg area?
Yeah.
Exploring on weekends, you said, some of what was left there. So what were you doing there, and what kind of stuff were you exploring? What did you see? What attracted your interest in Obersalzberg 15, I don't know when this was, 20 years ago, whenever it was?
Yeah. Well, Hitler held a series of monologues which were transcribed. It was called the table conversations, the Tischgespräche, where he was reminiscing about his life and his past and everything. And at one point he says, all of my greatest times and all of my great ideas, quote unquote, great ideas, were conceived on the Obersalzberg. And I think this is something where you can take Hitler at his word. And I was surprised at when I was going there, the ruins of his house were basically in a forest. There was no type of documentation center. It was basically visited by Hitler pilgrims who were coming there to carve runes into trees, to build shrines, to come and honor Hitler. And what astonished me was that a place of such historical significance was so neglected. And so I did spend a lot of time exploring it, but also trying to understand Hitler's relationship to this place, because keep in mind, one of the most horrific despots in world history. But what did most dictators or people like that do? Caesar, the Romans built these huge temples, these huge palaces in Rome. The czars built the Kremlin. Louis XIV, the 14th, built Versailles. And what did Hitler do? He went up to this mountaintop in sort of basically a 3-story house. The Eagle's Nest is a different story. Hitler actually didn't like that. He only went there, I think, 9 times. But his place where he would bring the leaders to, Mussolini, Chamberlain, the name, on and on and on. He brings people here and he says, this, most people, they construct these big buildings and say, this is an expression of my power, of my achievement. Hitler would bring you to an isolated mountaintop, put you in front of this huge picture window and say, this is my realm, this is my power. And I think it's an interesting understanding of the relationship of a major historical figure with an incredible amount of power, but where his point of orientation was. He did not like Berlin. I mean, even his legal residence was never in Berlin. He was chancellor. His official residence was there, but Hitler's legal residence remained on the Prinzregentenplatz in Munich. And the place where he spent all of his time, and actually, at one point, actually toward the end, before he decided to stay in Berlin, the plan was that he was going to go to the Obersalzberg and make a final stand there. So I think it's a very evocative place, but also for understanding Hitler and who he was, I think it's an incredibly important place that tends to be, overlooked by history and historians.
Chris, we got time for one more if you got it.
Yeah, well, Timothy, one thing I like to ask this to people like you who have spent so much time studying this one period of history and this one man. Given what you brought to your research, writing this book, is there anything that surprised you when you were done, or something that a new angle or something you hadn't seen before? Or, what was your takeaway from doing the research for this?
Yeah, I guess what truly astonished me was how many times and how close Hitler came to failure. Just how lucky he was to have come into the chancellorship at that particular moment. And how unfortunate for the rest of the world. And my takeaway as a historian is, and as I say, what we do is we need to explain how events unfolded and how we got from where we were to where we are. But it amazes me how many issues and how many different paths we end up blinding ourselves to, through the process of historical hindsight.
Yeah.
Well, Timothy Ryback, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour to chat about your recent book, Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power. Definitely a good read. I really enjoyed it, and I
just want to say too, and when you're buying it, if you buy it on Amazon, you shouldn't. You should buy it somewhere else. But if you do buy it on Amazon, and you get your multiple choice, also buy Timothy's book on Hitler's Library, because.
All right, I will check that one out. And I was going to say I will definitely be borrowing from your discussion when we're visiting on the Obersalzberg on next Sunday. But thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Apologies for the French internet.
And it got better. It got better, especially in the last 10 minutes. You look great now.
Everybody knows what you look like now, so that's good.
Everybody signed off the show, and suddenly you look good. So no. All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Next week, Chris.
Yeah.
Vacation's over. We're back live. We got to be on our best behavior. No retakes. Ooh. Not like take 27 here of the this end of the show. And our guest is going to be Stephen Harding. He's the author of G.I.G. Men, which is the untold story of the FBI's search for American traitors, collaborators, in spies in World War II Europe. So we're going to have a few weeks of live shows.
Get out.
I know, and this is the first one. I mean, we have now convinced everybody that we're just pre-recorded till the end of time, but we'll be back live. And so we'll send out a newsletter beginning of next week with our next 4 shows. I think the next 4 are all live. So we're getting into it as we approach D-Day, which is a few months away, but we're going to have a special multi-guest show on D-Day, a 90-minute show this year. So, which is going to be the day after D-Day. So it's all going to have happened already. But
just so you know how it turns out.
Right. We assume that until then you don't know. But so just keep your eyes and ears closed on D-Day, and then the show will work perfectly for you.
There you go.
So thanks everybody for joining us. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook. Yeah, shout at us on Blue Sky. Listen to our podcast. It just keeps you very busy. Back us on Patreon. It takes a long time to say it all, so to do it all would take like all day. And you can browse all of our 295 previous episodes on historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.